All right, Larry Moss, this is a special video coming out straight for you. I read your Facebook post. I saw that you were confused about the sugya, and it really bothered me. And I went for a swim, and I said, I go home. I gotta explain this to Larry and to anyone else who cares about it, and I'll put the video up on Facebook, and hopefully that will help. So I'm going to walk through the whole sugya and try to explain it as best I can. Ba'amine Abaye me Rabba. So Abaye asked Rabba, Haomer lechaviro. Someone says to his friend, Anasto pitita et biti. Right? You either raped or you seduced my daughter. Badin. I stood you up to court. And you became obligated to pay me the fine for what you did. Vehu Omer lo anasti lo patiti velo himadati bedin. He denies the whole thing. Velo nitchayavti lecha mamon. And I'm not obligated to pay you money. Venishba. He swears he's not obligated to pay the money. Vehoda. Right, and then he admitted it. Now we know that Rabbi Shimon, if you admit that you owed a knas, that you did something that makes you owe a fine, you don't have to pay that on your own self-admission. The Rabbi Shimon, what's the rule here? In this case, to Rabbi Shimon, kevan de amad badin, since he was already made obligated by the courts, mamona have, that's like money, which you are obligated on your own admission. And he would be obligated to bring the sacrifice for a false oath. O Dilma, or perhaps Afagav Damad Badin, even though he stood trial, Knas have, it's still a fine. And again, when you admit that you when you admit that you owe a fine, you don't have to pay the fine. So therefore, if you lied about that and then admitted that you lied about that, since had you told the truth in the first place, you wouldn't have been obligated any money, so you're not obligated to bring the korban, the sacrifice. Amarle, so Rabba answers Abaye, Mamona have, right? By the fact that the court convicted him, it's money. And he's obligated to bring a sacrifice. Eitive, Abaye brings a kasha to Rabba. Rabbi Shimon says, Yachol haomer lechavero anasto pitita et biti. It might be that if you say to your friend, you raped or seduced my daughter, vehu omer, and he denies it, lo anasti velo pititi, I didn't rape or seduce her. Or, and I'm going to skip a couple examples here because they're not really all that relevant. Yachol yehei chayav, you might have thought that he's obligated to bring the sacrifice for his false oath. Talmud Lamar, the Torah says, v'kichesh ba'amido bepikadon, and he denies owing his friend a deposit, o betsumat yad, or some kind of either loan or some kind of business arrangement, o begezo, or theft, o a shakid amito, that he obligated, that he didn't pay him correctly, o matzah aveda, or he found a lost object, v'kichesh ba v'nishbal shaker, and he denied it and he falsely swore. Ma'elu, just as these things are miyuchadim shehen mamon, the whole list over there, none of it was a knas, a fine. Af kol shehu mamon yatsu elu shehen knas. Anything that's money and you falsely swear about it, you have to pay, and these things are only a fine. Now, we knew that already. The key is the next step. Ma'elav b'she'amad badin. Is that not a case where he was already convicted and nevertheless anything that's a knas, it doesn't make a difference. Even if it's a fine, it doesn't make a difference. If it's after the court case, he's still not obligated for a korban on his own self-admission and a false oath. And then Rabba says, no, Be'shelo amad badin. That refers to a case where he didn't stand trial. Had he stood trial and been convicted, it would have turned, the fine would have turned into money, and he would have been obligated for the sacrifice. Now, the Gemara raises a kasha. Abaye raises a difficulty. V'hami dereisha, since the earlier part of the Braita, which we have not yet read, is Amad Badin, when he stood trial, Seifa Nami, the second clause, is also Bisha Amad Badin. What does it teach in the Reisha, in the first half? Tikatani Reisha, for the first half, teaches I only know this about things that you pay the principal for, that you would have to pay. You have to take this. If you took a false oath, you would have to bring a sacrifice. Tashlume kefel, tashlume arba v'chamisha, the payment, the double payment, the 4-time payment, the 5-time payment, veha onesa mafatev motzi shemra, a rapist, a seducer, or a man who libels his wife, which are all of these are all fines. Minayin, how do I know that's true? Talmud lomar u'ma'ala ma'al, right? And he deceived it. Riba, it expanded it. So we can see over here that according to this opinion, if you deny owing a knas, a fine, you still have to bring, and then you admit it, you still have to bring the sacrifice. Now that accords better with the rabbis from before. Hey Chidami, the Gemara Rabbah would ask, Abai would say, whose opinion is this? If he didn't yet stand trial, is there any double payment? After all, there can never be double payment until the court makes him liable, because you're not liable to bring a double payment on your own admission. Elepshita b'shamad badin. That first half of the Braita must be a case where he already stood trial and he's obligated for those things. Umidaresha b'shamad badin, seifa nami b'shamad badin. The second clause is also b'shamad badin, which is, the second clause was Rebbe Shimon. And Rebbe Shimon would say, even if he stood trial, he's still not obligated for those things, because they are not mammon, they're not money, they're a fine. And that's Abai's shita, Abai's methodology. Amar le Rabba says back to him, I could give you this weak teirutz, this weak resolution, that the first part is b'shamad badin, when he stood trial, and the seifa is not when he didn't. In other words, there's a difference in situations, and the whole Braita is Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon would say, if he stood trial, then it becomes mammon. But if he didn't stand trial, it's not mammon. But that's a difficult teirutz. Because shinui dechika lo mishanin lecha. How could the whole Braita be Rabbi Shimon? De'im kein amartali. If that was right, you would say to me, leitnei reisha Rabbi Shimon omer. Let's say in the beginning of the Braita that it's Rabbi Shimon, or leitnei seifa divrei Rabbi Shimon, or let's say at the end of the whole Braita the words of Rabbi Shimon. Ela, rather, I'm going to tell you kula b'she'amad badin. Kula. Hold on a second. I closed the door here. Quiet downstairs. Sorry about that. That's what happens when you have a extemporaneous little video here. Ele kula b'shamad badin. The whole Braita is when he stood trial. Veresha, the first half of the Braita, is Rabbanan, and the Seifa, the second half, is Rabbi Shimon. Now that's a problem. If it's after court, Rabbah said Rabbi Shimon would make him liable for the false oath, because he stood trial and it's now mammon. But Rabbah says, Umodina lach linyan korban shvua. I agree with you for the korban, the Rachmana patre mi v'kichesh. From that midrash, I'm not going to go back over it, the Torah exempted him. That I agree with you on. V'chi kamina mamon have, when I told you that it was mamon, money, what did I mean? Lehorisho levanav. That, and here's what gets, I think, at least the most tricky, that it's money in the sense that if the the person who was supposed to get the money dies, what happens? It's mamon, and it goes to the sons, his inheritors, right? Even though he hasn't collected it yet, it's a debt to the father, even though he hasn't collected it yet. Now, had this happened beforehand, right, if he died before the court case, then he would have been obligated, it would have been the daughters, right? Because the father was no longer around, and the daughter would collect the money from the rapist or the seducer. I realize the end there is a little difficult, right? But what Rabbah is trying to say is that in some way, after the court has already convicted him, and they said that they convicted him, that it's now money. Right? What is the ramifications of it being money and no longer a knas? If it's money, then he can inherit. He bequeaths it as part of his inheritance to his regular inheritors, meaning his sons. If it's still a knas, a fine, then the fine would go to the daughter in the absence of the father, which is the general rule of where this fine for rape or seduction goes. If there's no longer a father, it goes to the daughter. All right. I hope that was a little helpful. I know it was a little long, but it is a particularly difficult piece of Gemara.